Welcome. This is Lecture 2, The Rise of Political Parties, Party Eras in American History. This is one that you will see a question or two on an AP exam from what I've seen. And I think there's probably been one or two free response questions on the same material. So let's go ahead and dig in and see what has happened in our history. Now, the Constitution, remember, mentions nothing about political parties. And it's not until we read about the concerns of Madison in Federalist 10 that the subject is even brought up. Political parties or political factions have been traditional throughout world history. And Madison was resigned to the fact that they would be an element in American politics, and they were from the beginning. And then when we look forward in our history, we see that the 19th century is dominated by both patronage, which is brought in by Jackson, in particular after 1828, and the rise of the party machine, which exists throughout the 19th century, well into the 20th century. But its heyday is from the Civil War to probably the Great Depression. But what I think in a lot of ways affects the quality of the civil service and what takes perhaps civil service out and ends patronage is the passage of the Pendleton Civil Service Act in the 1870s after the assassination of Garfield. And since then we've had a fairly professional bureaucracy, like most other first world countries. We may not like what they do, we may not like all the rules that they implement, but it is rather professional. And when you have a professional civil service, you don't have to deal very much in the way of patronage with a civil service that isn't professional. And you can see that type of drag in many third world countries, in which you pay the civil service in order to get what you need done. Now, the origins, of course, we mentioned just a minute ago, were the concern of James Madison. He wrote in Federalist 10 about the baneful effects of the spirit of the party, and that simply was true, and it simply did occur, and where he thought that democracy or the establishment of a democracy would create a whole different set of circumstances, it really didn't. Because if people want to get involved with government, they need to find people that believe in the same things that they do, and consequently, they need to find the ability to affect change. And the more people that they gather that feel the same way, the more the change that they seek can occur. So consequently, political parties are going to be one of the mainstays of American politics, whether we again like them or not. Now, the reason the political parties begin to coalesce around different themes and different needs is simply because they're a necessary ingredient in getting things done in government. So Hamilton's financial plan to get the United States back on more firm footing. Jefferson seeking support in Congress for the purchase of that large piece of land called the Louisiana Purchase. And I'll read it just like it says here. The necessity of an institution that unifies government in order to overcome the system of separation of separation of powers and checks and balances that divide the government creates a need for political parties. And we see that certainly today. So let's look at some of the things that we're going to see. But first, before we get there, we're going to include some things in that weren't in the previous one. They certainly have an effect on how the parties operate. But we know that there are 50 local or what we call state parties. And the state parties run the primaries. They do this kind of with some guidance from the national parties. But the reason that the state parties run the primaries is that there is no national primary, and consequently, then there are a number of types of primaries and caucuses, and we're going to look at this again, but it's kind of an introduction now. We're going, and once we look at these three, you'll understand why we have to look at them again. But closed primaries are the easiest ones to understand. A closed primary simply says that anybody who's choosing our Democrats or our Republicans has to be a registered Democrat or a Republican. No one else can vote in that primary. So that simply means that the parties have a great deal of control over the primary itself. The states give the parties that control, and the candidate that is chosen by party members is usually the one that is most loyal to the building blocks of what the party is trying to achieve. But here's the thing: most people, most American voters, don't like closed primaries because it blocks them out. Parties say, though, that this is the only fair way for them to operate, because in a closed primary, only party members are electing the candidates. Open primaries create a jumble. Now, open primaries exist in a lot of states, and usually what happens with open primaries is that members of that party, let's say up until 2010, the Democratic Party here in California had an open primary. That meant that anybody who was a registered Democrat or anybody who was a registered voter who classified themselves as an independent could ask for a Democratic Party ballot and vote in the Democratic primary. If you were a member of the Republican Party or the Green Party or the American Independent Party, you could not vote in the Democratic primary. But if you were a registered independent, you could. The Republicans in California had a closed primary. So even if you wanted, as an independent, to vote in their primary, you couldn't. It was closed. Open primaries and all their variations exist in many states. And sometimes they will even allow registered members of the other party, Republicans, to, for instance, vote in their primary. That's what makes it open. But in California, the Republican and Democratic parties sued in 2002, and the Supreme Court said the parties can't control their own primaries. So California switched back to a closed primary system with a little bit more openness among the Democrats. And then in 2010, voters decided that they wanted a different type of primary, and that leads us to the third type, jungle primaries. And jungle primaries are interesting because you see, again, a variation. But with jungle primaries, everyone runs and everyone can vote no matter what primary you're in. So California has a primary, let's say for the state Senate seat 25, which is our state assembly seat 25, which is our state assembly seat here. They don't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. In a jungle primary, you just have to be a registered voter, and you can vote. Now, some jungle primaries take the top finisher of the Democrats and take the top finisher of the Republicans and then run those two in the general. California is very different. They're like Louisiana. They're like a couple of other states. The top two finishers run in the general election. So the top two finishers in the primary election run in the general election. And if there are two Democrats or two Republicans, that's just the way it is. What this means is that the parties are not in control of the primaries. And certainly sometimes you can get someone who doesn't agree with the stance of the party representing your party, or you get shut out entirely. If you're a Republican Party and two Democrats are running, you don't have a choice anyways. Now the fourth way are caucuses, and caucuses are a throwback to the 19th century. And the reason the caucuses have been in decline is that caucuses are not open to members of any other party. Only caucuses are only open to members of your party, with some caveats. I think maybe Iowa and others will allow independents to come in and vote with their type of caucuses, and we'll see an example of that in class. But caucuses are the type of election that gets the smallest number of people involved. It requires you to show up and usually spend some time at a caucus, whereas primaries are, whether it's jungle open or closed, are usually you walk on, you get your ballot from the precinct worker, or you get your ballot at home in the mail, you fill it out, you send it in, and you're done. Caucuses require some participation, and they're kind of out of favor, but caucuses can be very, very controlled by the parties involved. Now, this is one you'll have to put in your notes. Driving question: how do primaries and caucuses impact the power of national party organizations? Remember, we have kind of a weak party system. So consider the effects of the three types of primaries, and how do the primaries or caucuses impact the power of the national party organization? So that'll be in your notes. That'll be also your first driving question. Now, the national party organizations are also built upon kind of this pyramid. At the very top, in both parties, is the National Convention. That is held every 4 years. The National Convention sets everything up. It does not run the day-to-day operations, but it basically gives members of that party kind of a vision through the platform of what it would like that party to achieve in the next 4 years or until the next convention. The day-to-day operations are conducted by the National Committee and by the DNC or the RNC chairman. There's the Republican National Committee headed by Reince Priebus. There's the Democratic National Committee headed by Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And then there are the 50 state organizations. Each of the states has a state Republican committee, a state Democratic committee. And your second driving question is, relative to other countries, our national organizations are weak. Why is that? And I want you, this will be how I know whether you looked at this or not. I want you to look at 2 European parties. I don't care what the parties are in England, so it could be the Conservatives, or otherwise known as the Tories. It could be Labour, or it could be the Liberal Democrats. And then I also want you to look at the party organizations in Germany. So it can be the Christian Democrats, it can be the Social Democrats. I don't care, but look at one of them and contrast and compare those organizations compared to ours. And it would be good, since especially you have the Google presentation, give me a little bit more of a narrated presentation rather than something that you're writing and then upload it. Now, the party and government, which was the next section in your book. The party, when we look at this, it's kind of a stepping stone. So the party and government is what we see nowadays. President Obama, Senate Majority Leader to be Mitch McConnell, Speaker of the House John Boehner. These are party members that are actually elected to whatever body there are. But then it's a little bit different after that. Because of interest groups and because of PACs, the candidate loyalty to the party is not what it used to be, though it is better than it has been in the recent past. And we saw many of these party loyalty tests kind of thrown at the candidates, because how loyal they had been to President Obama, voting for him 99% of the time, and yet saying that they were also independent. You sometimes can't have it both ways. Now, once elected, the party tries to keep you in line, but can they always rely on you for support? And so, for instance, there are, especially for blue dogs, or what's left of the blue dogs, the party, Democratic leadership sometimes expects that portion of the party to vote against what the rest of the party is voting for, simply in order to be reelected again. And it really hasn't worked, but that's the way it's been done. And then when you're in Congress, political parties are coalitions. You coalesce around around issues that are important to your party. So Democrats, it could be environment, immigration, or whatever. Republicans, it would be fiscal constraints and balanced budget and things like that. But that's what the party does in government. Your book will look that over. I didn't want to spend too much time on it because there's a lot of stuff in today's lecture that we have to look at. Now, what are party eras? Well, we'll look at it from three different perspectives. Party eras themselves are when one party wins most of the elections because its coalition is bigger. So, for instance, 1860 to 1892, Republicans were the dominant party simply because their coalition was bigger. A critical election changes the dynamic of that. It's an electoral earthquake. And we haven't had one of those kind of since 1968, but we have had many electoral earthquakes. 1994, to some extent, 2010 and 2014 have been small electoral earthquakes. But what happens is new issues emerge, new coalitions come together, and they reformulate the political surroundings. The best example of that, the clearest example of that, would probably be 1932. The political landscape of 1928 differs very, very much from the landscape of 1936. Now, also what happens is what we call party realignment, in which the shifting of groups in a coalition occurs usually during a critical election, but not entirely due to that, because we can see some differences in today's landscape that really can't always be tied to a critical election. And now here we see the critical elections, and they're divided by 6. 1796 to 1824 is Party Era 1. Party Era 2 is here. Party Era 3 is here. Party Era 4 is here. Party Era 5 is here. And Party Era 6 is here. So let's look at what they are. The first party system occurs in the first 30 years of the Republic. The critical elections are 1824 and 1828, but for very, very different reasons. Now, of course, the overriding thing here is that Madison warned of factions. They developed into the Federalist Party and the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. In this time frame, the nation expanded beyond the original 13 colonies across the Appalachians, so Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, all those states became states. What is interesting is the Federalist Party is dead by 1810, with the exception of the federal judiciary, in which it is alive until the 1830s. In fact, the greatest Federalist is John Marshall, the Chief Justice, the second Chief Justice of the courts. The Democratic Republicans morph into the Democrats during this stage. Now, 1824 is one of those elections, like in 1800 and 1804, in which the election goes to the House of Representatives, and the shenanigans that occurred in 1824 to give the presidency to John Quincy Adams creates a situation where Andrew Jackson in 1828 really does double down. And the 1828 election is critical in Jackson winning to usher in the second party system. Now, we all know the stories from AP US history or US history in which job seekers traipse their way through the White House after the inauguration of Andrew Jackson and destroy the interior of the White House. And the second party system really is the age of patronage, and the bureaucracy itself would see the ebb and flow of who won and who lost, as people seeking jobs because they were part of the winning coalition would get jobs, and then when their man was gone, they would lose their job as someone else came and took that job from them. Now, this 1828 to 1856 period, Jacksonian Democrats versus the Whigs. The Democrats become the modern Democratic Party. They're no longer Jacksonian Democrats, but they're the modern Democratic Party, and they don't really have a very strong opposition party. The Whigs are there, the Know-Nothings are there. The Whigs, though, are pretty much dead by the mid-1840s, late 1840s. What's notable, though, is the nation continues to move west. The battle develops between the West and the East, which will be kind of an overriding theme until the end of the century. And two issues are here at hand: slavery, of course, and states' rights. And those are the dominant political questions um, that dominate the era. The third era is the era post-slavery. The critical election, of course, is 1860, which is a four-way race between Abraham Lincoln and three others. But after the Civil War is won, what we see is a Republican dominance. And the Republicans are responsible for doing two things. They are the party against slavery, and they end it. And they're the party that attempts to put the Union back together again, and it kind of does. But it's done so ham-handedly that the South becomes the anti-Republican part of the Union and remains that way until the 1970s. The dominant thing that occurs in this time period is that the nation continues to expand to the west, and now there's agriculture and mining have come together against the industrial interests of the East. So it's the West and the South versus the Midwest and the East. And this is why the Republicans are kind of the dominant party of the era. Then we have the fourth party system. And the fourth party system is a continuation of the Republican domination. But what happens is the Republicans see the writing on the wall, and they realize that the nation is becoming more urban. And so with it becoming more urban, they decide to abandon the issues that are important to their agricultural segments. And what that does is creates a new coalition of big business and working classes versus democratic rural interests. You'll notice that in 1892, the first contest between McKinley and the first 1896, the first contest between McKinley and William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan talked about in his Cross of Gold speech, all those things that Democrats were opposed to, which is big business, how the farmer was being put upon, and so on and so forth. It's also kind of the end of an era in which you see a rise of a number of parties, especially the Populist Party. The Populist Party gives us so many great ideas: the direct election of senators, the income tax, and things like that. But it's kind of the end of an era. But the GOP casts its lot with the cities and becomes an urban party, and it continues its domination through the end of the Roaring '20s. But what changes everything, of course, is the Great Depression. And that critical election is 1932. What occurs is a Democratic dominance under FDR, helped along by the New Deal programs, prolonged by the fight for World War II, but it established a grand coalition. And I didn't take that, I repeated it, sorry about that. Very, very odd: urbanites, labor, Catholics, Jews, the poor, Southerners, blacks, and farmers. And as we go from the 1950s onwards, some of those groups begin to lop off. Farmers start to go, urbanites start to go, and then ultimately Southerners go. So what you have left are blacks, Jews, labor, and urbanites. Now, 1968, the end of the FDR coalition and the beginning of the era of divided government, which we're still in. So this is the longest lasting at 48 years, the longest lasting at 46 years, the longest lasting era that we've had. And what that did was usher in the era or the arrival of split ticket voting, which means the president is of one party and the Congress is controlled by the opposite party. And typically, presidents were Republican and Congress was Democratic. It was also the era of divided government, as well as the era of party de-alignment, in which voters move away from both parties and become increasingly independents. And so we see this kind of as an era of party neutrality. Now, in addition to that, what has spurred on some of these changes is that Republicans, in seeing that they were more of a suburban party and wanting to grow, began to focus on the South. Nixon had a Southern strategy. Reagan in the 1980s built a coalition of unhappy white suburban middle class, Southern white Protestants, hard hats, big business, etc., to become successful. Clinton, in a way, resurrected the FDR coalition in the 90s, because he especially brought Southern middle class moderates back into the fold, these Reagan Democrats, which had strayed from the party. But they're pretty much gone. They've moved back over to the Republican Party. The election of 2000 gave us a Republican president who won only a minority of popular votes, gave us a 50-50 Senate and a House with a narrow Republican majority. And that's kind of where we've been dicing back and forth in that time. Now, in today's, based on the 2014 elections, we can see that the same thing has happened. We have an executive branch, which is Democratic. We have a Senate and House, which is Republican. And I want to explain some things here. There's one senator missing because there's a Senate election in Louisiana on December 6th, which will decide the final vote here. And we're short here. There should be 435 House members. There's 432. There's 3 elections that are undergoing recounts. They were so close that we can't count which way they're going to go. The same thing with governorships. There's 31 Republicans. There's 17 Democrats. There should be 50, but that's because there's 2 independents. One of them. And then there's 99 state legislatures. And the reason there isn't 100 is that Nebraska not only is a unicameral legislature, but they're also nonpartisan. But they definitely lean to the right. But 68 of those legislatures are run by Republicans, 30 run by Democrats. And this is probably the most Republican the nation has been in quite a while. So this is our look at the party eras. This kind of covers up through page 260. Our next thing that we'll look at is the rise and the effect of third parties. So this ends lecture 2.